Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 34, and we have Christian Pina joining the show. Christian started out in the fantasy and daily fantasy sports world before moving to Las Vegas and transitioning to sports betting. He's the man behind the Hook Report and the editor of content at the Sports Gambling Podcast, as well as a professional sports and UFC Handicapper and bettor. Christian shares his insights and perspective on being a professional sports bettor in Las Vegas. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Christian Pina. Today, I'm joined by Christian Pina. Christian, thank you very much for joining me.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for having me, man. I'm thrilled to finally make my debut on this podcast. I've been a fan for a very long time.
Awesome. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, right on the outside of it, on the North Shore of New England, a little town called Gloucester, Massachusetts. If you guys are familiar with the movie The Perfect Storm, that's where I grew up. I eventually moved to Boston, where I was in the Coast Guard for 9 years right after high school, and eventually transitioned into full-time handicapping and DFS, and eventually made the move to Las Vegas to do both of those things full-time.
So what's it like, the betting scene in Boston or even Massachusetts where you grew up? Was it common to talk about betting lines on, I guess, probably the Celtics, the Patriots, and those types of teams?
Yeah, everything is very underground. It's not as kind of in the forefront the way that a town or a city like New York is, where there's a lot of money within the Wall Street guys, and it's the worst kept secret in the world. How much betting goes into Wall Street and these kind of businesses and stuff like that. Boston is more it's a tight knit community, so it's also a lot smaller than places like New York or Chicago and stuff like that. So it's a lot more underground. There's a lot more kind of corner bookmakers and guys that have been making book for 30, 40 years, where it's been in the family and stuff like that. So it's much more underground, honestly, which is kind of why I eventually made the move to Las Vegas.
Interesting. So how did you get involved, I guess, through your teenage years or at high school? Or, I mean, you probably followed sports and then it was sort of part and parcel with that perhaps. But were you following like a sports writer that would talk about betting? Or how did you get content back then?
So sports was always something I was interested in, just from kind of a fan perspective. Of course, all the Boston teams, Red Sox, Celtics, Patriots, and things like that. But I was fantasy football and fantasy sports was even before daily fantasy sports was kind of a thing back then. Fantasy sports was always something I was very good at. I loved, kind of the research aspect of it. And again, back then it was very small stakes, work leagues, high school leagues and stuff like that. But I always found myself being the one that was kind of putting in the most effort when most guys were just kind of, shooting in the dark and stuff like that. And this was back when I was in high school, it was 2002, 3, 4. I graduated 2007. So this was kind of back before the internet's golden age, before social media. I mean, this was the days of MySpace and Facebook eventually came into it, and then Twitter was even after Facebook and stuff like that. So this stuff wasn't even around back then. It was a lot of I think like Roto World was the first website that really got me into kind of being able to be the gold standard in terms of research and stuff like that. But like all these DFS sites that you see out there now, Twitter, all that wasn't around. So it was much harder because you were kind of on your own. That you weren't able to build these networks of friends or these networks of Twitter followers and stuff like that.
So what made you ultimately decide to go to Vegas? Obviously, it's the gambling mecca in the US, but it must have been a tough decision to pack the bags and head out there, I would imagine.
Sure. I mean, in short, gambling being legal. It's the only place in the United States where sports betting is legal. And at a certain point of having, these bookmakers in on the corner and things being kind of sketchy and not knowing if you were going to be able to get paid, if there was going to be a story, I just wanted something I wanted to go to a place where gambling was going to be easy. And not only that, Vegas as a whole is just, it's changed a little bit now, but it still has that, I don't want to say outlaw feel to it, but it has that, it's a community built on gambling. It is what it is, right? These casinos, they provide jobs. Gambling isn't looked at as the taboo that it is in some other places in Las Vegas, and I wanted to be a part of that. It was what really kind of drove me to move out here and start gambling full time. Once I had built up that bankroll, once I had decided that I had made the call that I was good enough to do this full time with kind of no safety net, it was the only place in the world where it felt like it was okay to do this. So that's what kind of drove me there.
So when you got to Vegas, how did you decide what you were going to bet on? I guess you probably started with a small bankroll like you mentioned. How was the beginning? Were you losing money? Were you winning money? Did you feel like you were good at it in the beginning? Did it take time? Take us through sort of your mindset when you started and how that was.
Yeah, so when I started, I was gambling obviously when I was still in Boston, but when I came out here, I wouldn't say a small bankroll, but I had built up a sizable bankroll because I was doing daily fantasy sports almost full time at that point. So my strength was kind of in player projections and player props. So I was really playing those a lot when I got out here, which did very well, which helped me out. I've learned so much more on the business side of things now that I've moved to Las Vegas, as far as, odds makers' perspectives. People talk about trap lines, if those exist. It's given me perspective on the other side of the counter so much more, which I think people really take for granted, because I'm able to talk to these odds makers and build these relationships with people that have been handicapping for a very long time. And, I always say that there's levels to this, right? Like there's people sometimes that are only within, social media and quote unquote gambling Twitter, they don't realize how deep this stuff goes. They don't realize how people that have only been gambling for so long have been successful, because the best people in the world aren't usually on Twitter, giving out their plays or stuff like that, to be honest with you. That's not to say that there's not, fantastic people and great people that are doing it and doing it within these social media platforms and providing great written content, but it's not the only avenue. And, there's this kind of connotation that, these sharp groups that just kind of operate in the shadows and you never see them or you never hear from them. And there's just different levels to this. Being a professional handicapper doesn't mean that, it doesn't always fall in line with what the thought process is. But when I moved out here again, I concentrated on what I knew, which was player props, player projections, football players. That's what I kind of explored to start. And then I was using kind of the DFS model I had. And then from there, I just took it up. I started, again, now that I had all this time to do this full time, I started doing baseball, handicapping baseball, which led me into UFC, which led me into, all these other sports, because once a season ends, you either make money on the new sport or you don't pay your bills until the next time that comes around. So I never, knock on wood, when I got here, I didn't, go in a huge hole or anything like that. I was somewhat successful from the start.
So was football your sport of choice from the beginning?
Yeah, it always was. Daily fantasy in football was, again, how I got my start. So I translated that over into player props. And then once I had kind of figured that out is when I kind of went into more game stuff, side and totals and team projections and things like that. And football was always next to UFC is my most profitable sport. But I also do baseball as well.
In the beginning, I would imagine it wasn't a thriving DFS market back then. How were you doing analysis to be able to bet? Were you doing your sort of fantasy analysis and then translating that to sides and totals, or were you doing more statistical analysis on top of that to be able to bet on some of those sides and totals?
Yeah, so basically I just kind of translated, because what I actually didn't know is that daily fantasy sports is banned in Nevada. So of all things, I thought I would when I moved here, of all places, it's not legal in Las Vegas, right? So I was always planning to do daily fantasy sports on the side when I moved here, but I realized quickly that it was illegal if you're within the state of Nevada to play. So I was like, okay, that's one income stream that I'm not going to be able to take advantage of. So I had to basically adapt quick, and what I found was that some of the props for NFL players was kind of vastly either off on one side or the other. So I took advantage of that. And then once I was digging into all this stuff nonstop, because I didn't have to, or I couldn't even take the time to worry about daily fantasy, is when I started breaking into the team markets, sides and totals, and took it from there. And it's been very profitable.
Rethink the way you see sport. Every action or play can be represented by a series of numbers. When you analyse this data, patterns begin to emerge. If you follow these patterns and develop systems, you can play the game within the game. betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So I want to talk about UFC. There's not too many experts out there who do UFC or mixed martial arts. I mean, boxing perhaps, but that's a bit more of a legacy sport. But take us through your approach to UFC and MMA and how you handicap those events. Because I regular, let's call them regular sports, the big four and some others around the world, you can sort of understand the statistical approach. But what about something like that where there's obviously got to be a lot of knowledge of the sport and the people involved and the styles? Take us through how you think about UFC.
Right. So UFC was always a sport that I enjoyed as a fan, truly. And I had never really gotten into betting it or things like that outside of some of the big name fights, the pay-per-views. But it was something that drew me in because it was such an untapped market, really, is what it still is, to be honest. There's not a lot of guys that handicap it. There's not a lot of guys that handicap it professionally full-time like myself. And it's one of those things where I'm a big proponent of keeping things simple. I really am. I feel that a lot of handicappers and a lot of even recreational bettors make life just so hard on themselves when they don't have to. When I started breaking into this, I said, well, this market is very untapped. Odds makers don't. It's such a niche market that odds makers don't. They're not being paid to make UFC lines. That it's a collateral job that they have, and they can be exploited. They really can. And not only that, there's only one. You only have to handicap one fighter versus one fighter. Now, obviously, there's a ton that goes into that, right? I mean, styles make fights is the thing that you're going to hear so many different times, but as long as you can figure out what the path to victory is for each fighter. Being in a mixed martial arts fight, there's so many things that go into it, right? There's striking ability, there's ground and pound, there's jiu-jitsu, there's Muay Thai. There's all these different elements that go into a mixed martial arts fight. But if you can figure out kind of, how durable someone is, how their ground game is, how their submission defense is. If you have a great submission artist going up against someone that has unbelievable submission defense, there's a way to exploit what that path to victory is, right? Because obviously they're going to somewhat cancel each other out, which would lend itself to, say, going over in a round proposition bet, saying the fight is going to go over 2.5 rounds because I think that both styles are going to cancel each other out. Similar to striking. If both fighters are awful strikers, but they both are very durable and they aren't subject to the knockout, then the fight's going to go longer, which would lend itself to an over. Subsequently, if someone is on the tail end of their career, this happened with the latest, one of the last fights, which was Francis Ngannou versus Alistair Overeem at UFC 218. Alistair Overeem had been knocked out in 3 of his 6 fights. He was an aging veteran in the heavyweight division, while Francis Ngannou was an up-and-coming knockout artist, it's just stylistically, it was a fantastic spot for one of the fighters, and not to mention also going under the round prop because I felt that there would be a knockout. It's just one of those markets that it's very untapped. It's a niche market, and it's unlike football. It's not so heavily influenced by the public. The public on UFC want to do 2 things all the time. They want to either parlay a huge bunch of favorites to kind of negate the juice, and so that they can work with almost maybe an even money payout if they're lucky. So they'll parlay 4, 5, -3, 400 favorites. Or they bet the underdogs because they want to bet a little to win a lot, because underdogs do come in. It's a human fight. Anything can happen in these situations. So once you kind of figure this out and you can kind of walk that line and see kind of where these parlay busters or where these underdogs have a shot of coming into, it was a great market for me. It's been very successful, and I absolutely love it.
That's interesting. Do you think a regular person without sort of deep knowledge or hasn't been in a UFC gym before could transition over to UFC, or is it such a unique and difficult sport to handicap because of that?
As far as handicappers breaking into starting to handicap UFC, you mean?
Yeah, so if I'm an NFL person who, wants to handicap NFL, and then I think, I probably should get into UFC, is it something that you think someone or more people will transition over to because it's a possibility, or do you think you need to know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is and all the other types and forms and styles and whether they're from Brazil? I think they do it differently to when they're from, other parts of the world. It seems to me as a very difficult thing to comprehend, but do you think it is possible for someone who's not an expert to take it up and do well at it?
I think that hard work will conquer all. I don't think it's impossible for anyone to learn if they want to get into it, but I think that they just need to start at the beginning. You just have to be able to look at all aspects. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's impossible as a field to get into. It certainly helps if you have a fight handicapping background, if you used to handicap boxing fights, or you at least understand that. You just have to be able. I'm a big proponent of surrounding yourself with great people. I really am. I think that it's one of the most I don't want to say untapped, but it's something that handicappers don't do it enough of. I don't know if it's an ego thing, especially in the professional side. Handicappers are notoriously ego-driven, right? And I always talk about this with football, that they will back the Cleveland Browns 6 times and they'll only win once, but they will beat their shoulders being the only ones that were on them for that 6th and final win, even though they went 1-5. Everyone wants to look like the smartest person of the room. And I just feel like if you're an ego-driven person, you're not going to make it long in this business because, forgive me for, not being afraid to look quote unquote square because I'm making money. And so, again, hard work will always conquer all. It is by no means a sport that is impossible to get into handicapping. There's just a lot that goes into it, even though it's only one-on-one. You just have to be able to kind of essentially get into that person's head, or each fighter's head, rather, and attack it from all angles. More importantly than why or who I think would win a UFC fight, I have to be able to say how. Is it going to be a knockout? If it goes to the distance, is he a point fighter? Can he win on points if it goes there? If it turns into a ground game, can this person, get a submission? Can they defend a submission? Can they block strikes? It's just, there's a lot of things that go into it, but hard work will always win out. So if you can surround yourself with great people and help you kind of get started, I think that anybody could break into it. It's just if you're willing to put in the work or not.
So what's the betting marketplace like for UFC? And I would imagine, you probably, whether or not you bet outside of Nevada, there's obviously a global marketplace and some online bookmakers who you probably monitor at a minimum just to see what the consensus in the marketplace is. Is it a vibrant marketplace where, every event is up, every event has, round under-overs, they have a lot of different varying markets that you can bet into, or is it pretty confined to who's going to win, who's going to lose, how they're going to win, and maybe some under-over on the result?
Well, the thing with UFC is that they've had, over the past couple of years, their sport has grown so much, which has helped, right? They've had these wonderful, wonderful mixed martial artists come in, the Conor McGregors of the world, Brock Lesnar's, even going back further to beginning, Anderson Silva, Chuck Liddell. But as the sport has grown and it's seen these personalities come in, the demand for it has gone up, right? Because now you have the Ronda Rouseys of the world. Francis Ngannou, I think, is going to be kind of the face of UFC for a while. But, you still have Conor McGregor. You have all these John Jones before the suspension, Daniel Cormier. These guys that women for that matter. Women's MMA has blown up, with the addition of Chris Cyborg and these women that have come in and that have kind of blown the door open, which has all been thanks to Ronda Rousey. But with the popularity of the sport taking over, and for lack of a better term, it's taken over for boxing. UFC when it's in Las Vegas, it has that big fight feel, especially if it's a huge UFC pay-per-view. It's replaced boxing with that big fight feel. Obviously, Floyd Mayweather and Miguel Cotto and the Triple G fights and things like that in Vegas, they have the diehards, right? They have the boxing purists that don't believe in MMA, don't think it ever can hold a candle to mixed martial arts and the UFC. But as far as a market goes, with the demand and how popular it's become, markets are open, right? They have basically everything. Offshore has a lot more options, which is, to me, it's very weird. But in Las Vegas, you can bet on the money line for each fighter. You can bet over under round props, and that's really pretty much it. Limits are kept low. They're only for main events, some places will take about a $5,000 bet for main events. Other than that, the fight night pay-per-views, which are the free fights on Fox or FS1, those are limited to probably about $1,000 on each side. But offshore, again, I live in Vegas, so I obviously monitor offshore, but I don't bet offshore. I believe it's the same thing though. But it's such a sharp market because the guys that bet it do so well that limits are kept very, very low. So outside of main events, which I said are usually about $5,000 for a limit, most of the limits on the lower level card stuff are about $500 to $1,000. And again, that's not saying that you can't go. I mean, I could place, if I wanted to place $1,000 at 20 different sportsbooks in Las Vegas, I could do that. It's just, again, how much are you willing to go to every sportsbook in Vegas? The number's going to move as you do this. It just depends on your level of work ethic and how much money you want to be able to get down based on your perceived edge.
Interesting. I want to talk about what it's like betting in Vegas in a minute, but before we move off UFC, what was it like for McGregor and Mayweather? I'm guessing the limits were probably a bit higher to start with.
Yeah, those limits were pretty much taken off the board. To me, that was one of the most polarizing things in the world from a betting perspective, because what you had professionals. Now, when you look at this in hindsight, right, you had a 49-0 professional boxer who's been boxing his whole life against a mixed martial artist who had never been in a professional boxing match in their life. And the line continued to have reverse line movement and go towards Conor McGregor. When this opened, I was actually at the South Point Hotel and Casino when this line opened, and I was talking with the manager of that sportsbook. His name is Chris Andrews. He came over and he kind of knows me. He said, where this was before the fight was even announced, when it was in talks, and he said, "Here's the lines," and it was Floyd Mayweather minus 1,200, Conor McGregor plus 600.
Minus 1,200. It opened.
Yeah, that was before the fight was even announced.
Gotcha,
I think that they had the printed out sheet, and it was like you could get this line, if the fight has action within 1 year or something like that.
Yeah.
They actually opened it minus 800 plus like 500, something like that. But it was that high, and that line came all the way down to Floyd Mayweather minus maybe 500, maybe some 480s out there, and this was the biggest book liability in the last 20 years from what I've heard in speaking with odds makers, that they needed Floyd Mayweather. So what you had here was the public in groups of tens of thousands betting $100 to $300 on a 6-to-1, 5-to-1 payout, but there just wasn't enough professional money in the world. And believe me, the professional money was coming in on Floyd Mayweather as much as they could take. I mean, bets of $40,000 to $50,000 were on Floyd Mayweather, but books couldn't keep up with the money that was coming in on Conor McGregor from the betting public. One, because I think they wanted to see an upset. Two, I think that they have a little bit of disdain for what Floyd Mayweather is, what he stands for.
Yeah.
He's eccentric. He's had problems with domestic abuse and all these things. But it was just the most crazy dynamic to me. The way that I looked at it was, if I had told you I have an investment opportunity for you, and again, it's a fight, anything could happen, but I would say that there was a 98% chance of Floyd Mayweather winning that fight.
Yep.
If I had said there's a 98% chance I can give you 20% on your investment within a half an hour, don't you think a lot of people would do it? And that's what people didn't understand. They saw a minus 500 and they said, "Oh, I can't bet that. If I bet $100, I'm only going to get back, whatever it is. But if I bet Conor McGregor for 300, I'm going to get back 1,800."
Yeah.
So it was one of those things where it was just you needed a little bit of next level thinking there. You really did, to understand that this is an opportunity to make 20% of your investment within a half an hour at a very high success rate. Most likely.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I can't remember or imagine any other event that can take place like that, where you've got, the only ridiculous thing that I've heard is if Alabama played the Browns or some crazy thing like that.
That's one of my favorites too, yeah.
You hear that quite often, but it's just an amazing thing to think about, someone who's never lost, probably one of the best boxers ever, and then some guy who's coming from MMA to fight.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and totes, the Betfair exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell, fixed odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So I want to talk about the sports betting experience in Vegas. Do you place only bets on the apps, or you still prefer to do it in person with cash, so that tracking factor is not an issue?
It's both for me. It's one of those things where I've kind of been on all sides of it. I've had my limits cut because of it, and it's not a good thing. So you kind of got to find a new one. The good news is it's Las Vegas. There's so many places to place bets, and it's not as if you get your limits cut at one casino, it's going to happen at all of them, right? It takes a little bit for word to get around, and it's not as if you're going to get banned from these casinos because you're doing so well. It's very difficult to do that. I understand. People see these social media posts of these so and so is banned at all these casinos. It's not like that in real life. I'm here to tell you, I've been here for a long time. It's not like that, right? It depends if it's a convenience factor and I'm physically not able to make it to the sportsbook when I need to get a number, or a line is released when I'm somewhere else. Then I always keep at least 6-7 mobile apps up and running with a healthy amount of money inside them. To me, it's all about convenience, and it's just depending on what I need and who has the best number. If there's a number that I know is going to move and it's 20 minutes across town, I know I'm not going to get there. I'll just take the hit and deposit it on the mobile app. But cash over the counter is definitely the preferred method.
That's very interesting. A lot of jurisdictions, I certainly grew up in Australia, and those type of, having to drive across town to get a bet down at a certain number because that's what it's like at that book, and the not wanting to go on the app, those types of things weren't really an issue. So it's a fascinating part of the Vegas betting experience, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the evolution of it, right? It's the fact that it was created to compete with offshores, because there's nothing more convenient than being able to sit in your couch on your underwear and place bets all day, right? I mean, from a fun perspective, and say even if you're a recreational bettor only betting $50 to $100 a game, that's the best part of offshore that I think that Vegas was always going to have a tough time keeping up with, was the convenience factor. If you're not a professional, and again, there's a certain thing to be said for placing a ticket and getting cashed out. To me, it's one of the best feelings in the world. And I know I sound funny when I say that, but it's a high like no other to know that it's you against a bookmaker, and you came out on the right side. And I always say cashing a ticket it's one of the highest highs in the world. It really is, no matter the amount. I really truly feel like that. It's the equivalent of being. I always make the comparison to being a stockbroker. It's making the right investment. To me, it's one of the coolest things in the world. So even as a tourist perspective or a recreational outside bettor, I mean, I would highly recommend someone, if you're into sports and you're into sports handicapping and betting, to make the trip, because it's such a fun experience to be in a sports book with 40 to 100 people all rooting on one side or the other for any given outcome. It's experience it's like no other in the world in Las Vegas.
Doesn't sound like you're moving anytime soon.
No, I always say I feel like I was born for this town.
While we're on Vegas, what's some good places to go and watch games, or people are going to go for a weekend or whatever? What do you suggest in terms of experiences?
It depends on what you're looking for. It really, really does. There's books that are notoriously that cater to professionals. There's that are kind of give up the amenities, the luxuries that are kind of hole in the walls. My favorite place in the world in Las Vegas is the South Point Hotel and Casino. It's run by Jimmy Vaccaro and Chris Andrews, and I always say it's the last real sports book in Las Vegas left. It's kind of a little bit of a boys club in there, to be honest with you. It doesn't have the glitz and the glamour of some of these new up-and-coming casinos, the Cosmopolitans, Aria. But it's, from a sportsbook perspective, they'll take a bet from you. They'll work with you on what it is that you're trying to get down, what you want. And they do run my favorite book in Las Vegas, simply because they're willing to take a bet. They're willing to make it you versus them. They're the last book in town that I think still hangs their own lines. Their odds makers are the only ones that make them. They're not outsourced to these companies and these computer programs like all over. So from a kind of a customer perspective, my favorite sportsbook in town is the South Point. From a kind of a, if you're in town, you only have a day and you definitely want to sit inside of a sportsbook, there's no nicer sportsbook in town than the Las Vegas, the Westgate. Formerly, this used to be called the Hilton. Now it's the Westgate Superbook, and it's the biggest book in Las Vegas. It is one of the nicest. It is the nicest in my opinion. There is probably 80 huge big screen TVs. There's a ton of windows. There's a ton of seats. They have like man caves. All kinds of stuff in there, great food. So from a kind of an ambiance perspective, a bar perspective, I would recommend the Westgate. From a kind of an intimate kind of nicer, very low key, I would recommend Legacy's, which has like Legacy Stadium. It has stadium style seating. It's very small, but it's an absolutely beautiful sports book in there. And then from a limits perspective, I always recommend Aria. Aria and the M. M is a little kind of lesser known. M is actually where Floyd Mayweather bets exclusively. They will take the biggest bet in Las Vegas, hands down. It's a CGT owned property, and the sportsbook itself it's not the best. But if you need higher limits, I always steer people to go to two places: the M and Aria. And Aria it's very well known. They have one of the most famous poker rooms in the world there, along with Bellagio. But it just depends on what you're looking for and kind of what you want in terms of a feel or a vibe for Las Vegas sports betting.
So I want to ask one more question on that. Is there value for you living in Vegas and being around the sports books and around people like, Jimmy Vaccaro and Chris Andrews and being able to talk to them and obviously the VEASAN studio in the South Point, or going to the Aria or the M and placing some bets and being around sports bettors? Is there value for you to be in amongst all that? Because I know a lot of people now prefer to sit on their couch in their underwear, but is there some parts of that are still useful for you to gather information and whatnot?
Yeah, so to me, it was when I knew that I was going to start handicapping games full time. I wanted to immerse myself not only in handicapping but in the culture, and that sounds so kind of weird and to say, but I wanted to change my life, not just bet more games, right? I wanted to become a professional sports handicapper, and to me, there was no place to do that other than Las Vegas. People, again, I always say you have to surround yourself with great people, and even more than the odds makers and odds, guys that you can learn from, the best people in the world bet in Las Vegas. It is what it is, and that's not to say that there's not unbelievable people betting on offshores from New York and Chicago. I know syndicates, I know groups that don't live in Las Vegas. They bet through local accounts, on credit accounts, and they move lines, and they're some of the sharpest people in the world. But to me, I wanted to be able to build a network and build friends and colleagues and coworkers that I could kind of bounce ideas off of in a personal setting, and people that have I don't want to say it's a badge of honor to kind of live in Las Vegas and do this, and take it that step further. But it kind of is to me. And I know that may be a little bit outdated, and that may be, a little, kind of archaic way of looking at things. But I just always felt like I wanted to surround myself with people that were willing to make that move the way that I was, to do this and give 100% of it. So not only is it about, being able to talk with odds makers and being able to talk with guys on the other side of the counters and say, hey, well, why are you doing this? Or what's your liability on this? Or do you need some money on the other side of this? To me, it was the other professionals inside sports books that I've grown, been fortunate enough to make relationships with, was the huge thing for me. And it's not to say that I couldn't have done that via social media, or, most of my closest friends and guys that I gamble with and run things off and work with they're from social media, and some of them have never even been to Las Vegas, and they're some of the sharpest guys that I know. To me, I wanted to be able to immerse myself fully in Las Vegas and everything, the history of gambling and how this was the only place, and still is the only place that it's legal. So to me, it's everything wrapped into one. It's the culture of Las Vegas, where it's kind of, an outlaw town. It's the only one left. There's odds makers where I could learn from on that side of the counter, but not only that, I could learn from other professional handicappers that are in Las Vegas sportsbooks day in, day out, doing the same thing that I am, that are kind of in the trenches with you.
You mentioned gambling Twitter. What's your approach to gambling Twitter? I know there's some very bad touts out there that stand out, and it's hard to imagine that they make any money, but it sounds like they probably do. And there's a lot of it's a tough place to be around sometimes. How do you approach it?
Conceptually, I think that gambling Twitter is a great in theory and in concept, it is absolutely fantastic, right? It's a place that people can help each other win. But along the way, it turned into a little bit different of a thing. It turned into a place for people to sell a dream, right? And again, this is what people don't understand, is that the best people in the world can touch maybe 60% if they're lucky. And these people that at a certain point, you have to kind of take the blame off of a tout because they're trying to make money, and I understand that. And don't get me wrong, I am in fact a tout handicapper. I sell my UFC selections. I have nothing against tout handicappers when it's done the right way. I really don't, because with what I put into handicapping UFC and the hours upon hours of holidays, and I was looking at UFC film on Christmas and Christmas Eve to get ready for that upcoming event, and I don't think it's asking too much to want to be compensated for doing that. Now, it's not to say that if you're against it, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I just don't agree with that, and I'm not going to buy picks. That's well within your right. What I don't understand is the level of bickering, right? Like I said, somewhere along the way, people decided that they don't want to help people, or they don't want to help each other win, and it became kind of a contest to see who was the best. And I can do that. I'm hitting 70%, and to me it became so watered down so very fast. And I think that what people should take out of gambling Twitter, because again, it can be such a great place at times, is use it for what it is really my biggest advice. Build relationships on there. There's some of the best people in the world I know on quote unquote gambling Twitter are free guys that just all they want to do is help guys and put out free content. And it's people are like, oh, what do they get out of that? Well, some guys are in the exposure phase, right? They are looking to break into kind of getting into sports handicapping from and eventually maybe work for a major outlet in handicapping, work for VSiN, work for ESPN Chalk, work for Sports Insights, work for these companies. And the only way they're going to do that is to build a following. So they're going to provide the best free content that they can because they want to be noticed. And that was my goal initially when I started providing free picks and stuff like that. It was my dream was always to kind of write and do sports handicapping from a media perspective, and do kind of the VSiN route was kind of what I wanted to break into when I first started getting here. But to me, it's become, like I said, it's watered down. But I think that it's one of those things like, when people are like, oh, he's rough around the edges, but he has a great heart, is what I would kind of equate gambling Twitter to.
Before I let you go, I want to talk about the Super Bowl. What are your thoughts and feelings for the rest of the NFL season? And hopefully we can get this out soon so people can sort of check in to get your temperature on the season so far. And obviously Wentz injured, so there's some uncertainty with the Eagles, and obviously the Patriots and Steelers hanging around like normal. What are your thoughts for the rest of the season?
Well, I'm a Boston guy born and raised, so I'm going to say the Patriots are going to make it from the AFC. But from the Super Bowl, to me, I mean, I always, like I said, I have a very macro, big picture look when it comes to betting, especially football. What I look at it like it is a market, right? It's a fluid market, but I look at it almost as a long term. I make every play almost as a future, right? So instead of kind of like for the Browns, for example, I made a conscious decision to put basically, call it a one. I hate the word unit and the term unit, but I made a conscious decision to short the Browns every single week this year. It didn't matter if it was the best spot in the world, I thought they were getting too many points, if I thought that the scheduling spot was too good to pass up. And that's one example of a macro bet. And I do that with someone like, say, Matthew Stafford. If he is facing a team that is over 500, I would short his stock every single week. Those are examples of what I call macro bets. It's making the same bet, and what it does is it takes your head kind of out of it, right? It doesn't let you overcomplicate things. Once you feel you have an edge, you exploit it over and over and over again. So what I say is always bet on the streak, because you can only lose once betting on a streak, right? The ultimate gambler's fallacy is if roulette comes up red 10 times in a row, you're going to bet black the 11th, right? Well, you can lose 10 times if you bet black if it goes 20 in a row, but you can only lose once if you only bet until it goes red in a row. Now, the Patriots making it to 6 or 7 straight AFC championship games. It's the same thing as LeBron James making it to whatever that is, 7 or 8 NBA championships in a row. So until this proves to be not profitable, I mean, New England has been one of my largest bets every single season to win the AFC championship game. It's just, to me, again, you can only lose once betting on a streak, but you can lose so many times betting against it. So to me, again, this is where I differ from a lot of sharp handicappers that say, oh, well, there's value on this team or there's value on that team. Yes, there probably is, but you need to be prepared and know what you're doing enough to be able to hedge and be able to pick things off live and in-game to guarantee yourself profit. And those are skills that not all recreational bettors have yet. So as far as the Super Bowl goes for me, New England is a team that I obviously have, again, just because it's not a homer play. It's nothing this. It's not, oh, he's a square. What kind of professional handicapper is he picking the Patriots? That's very hard to do. It's the fact that I'm willing to, to listen to those critics and those people that say, oh, that's not hard to do. Well, it's been profitable 7 years in a row. So, that is what it is from an AFC side. I do think it will be Pittsburgh versus New England in an AFC championship game. So you can kind of, from a betting perspective there, you can kind of take futures if you want to take my advice there. And from a NFC side, I really do think that Minnesota is going to become the first team to host a Super Bowl this year. With the injury to Carson Wentz, I think that I always have been a subscriber to the idea that the moment is too big for first-timers. This happened last year with Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott, and I think it's going to happen to Jared Goff again. So I'm not a believer in the Rams. I just think that they're too young. I think that essentially a rookie quarterback, a rookie in the playoffs, that is, it's going to be too much for him. I really think it is. I think McVay is a first-year head coach, and those things take time. You need playoff experience. I'm also much higher on Atlanta than a lot of people because Atlanta has the same record this year than they did last year when they made the Super Bowl. But I think that Minnesota's defense is just too good, and I think that they're going to be I think they want to be the first team to ever host a Super Bowl. And as crazy as it seems to think that Case Keenum can lead a team to a Super Bowl, it's been done before with the likes of Trent Dilfer and things like that. So I'm going to go with Minnesota versus New England.
And I'm sure we all know who you would prefer to win that game. With Super Bowl props, in-game betting, there's a million other things, but we'll have to save that for another time. I really appreciate your time. Before I let you go, Twitter handle?
It is at Christian Pina, ChristianPina.
Christian, thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it, and all the very best for your betting in 2018.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au. And please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly.